He shuffled through the museum doors just like any other visitor. Gray hair, worn jacket, leaning slightly on a walking cane. The staff barely glanced up from their desks. Just another elderly tourist looking to spend a quiet afternoon among the displays of military history. But when he stopped in front of one particular exhibit, something changed. His breathing became shallow. His hands trembled as he stared at a black and white photograph mounted behind glass. The docent noticed him standing there, motionless, for nearly 10 minutes. Then she looked closer at the photo, and her clipboard clattered to the floor. Because the face in that 60-year-old combat photograph was the same face standing in front of her. Older, weathered by decades, but unmistakably the same man. The man whose story was written on the placard below. The man who wasn't supposed to be alive. Welcome to Silent Salute, where we discover the extraordinary people walking among us every day. Before we continue this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe these forgotten heroes deserve recognition, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're honored to have you as part of our growing community. The National Museum of World War II sat quietly on a Tuesday afternoon in downtown New Orleans. School groups had finished their morning tours, and the usual crowd of history enthusiasts hadn't yet arrived for the day's peak hours. It was the kind of peaceful moment that museum staff cherished, when they could actually focus on preserving history instead of managing crowds. Sarah Martinez had been working as a senior docent for 8 years. She knew every exhibit, every artifact, every story contained within these walls. The museum was her second home, and she took pride in sharing these pieces of history with visitors who might otherwise never understand the sacrifices made by previous generations. The Medal of Honor exhibit was her favorite section to guide tours through. 23 recipients from the Pacific Theater, each display meticulously researched and maintained. She'd memorized their stories, their hometowns, their final resting places. Some had lived long lives after the war. Others had died young, their potential cut short by the violence that had made them heroes. At exactly 2:47 p.m., the front doors opened with their familiar creak. Sarah looked up from her desk near the entrance to see an elderly man entering alone. Nothing unusual about that. The museum attracted plenty of senior visitors, many of them veterans themselves coming to pay respects to fallen comrades or to share stories with younger family members. This visitor was different somehow. He moved carefully, deliberately, like someone who'd learned to be cautious about every step. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of outfit someone might wear when they wanted to look respectable but had limited options. A simple brown jacket, faded blue jeans, scuffed leather shoes that had been polished recently but couldn't hide their age. Most visitors headed straight for the main exhibits or asked for recommendations about where to start. This man simply nodded politely to Sarah and began walking slowly through the galleries. No camera, no guidebook, no apparent agenda. Just quiet observation. Sarah returned to her paperwork, but found herself glancing up periodically to check on the solitary visitor. Something about his bearing caught her attention. The way he paused at certain displays while walking past others. The way he stood, despite his age and apparent frailty, with a straightness that suggested military training. The museum's World War II section was laid out chronologically, beginning with Pearl Harbor and progressing through the major campaigns of the Pacific Theater. The visitor seemed to be following this path, but he wasn't reading the informational placards like most people. Instead, he was studying the photographs with an intensity that bordered on recognition. At the Guadalcanal exhibit, he stopped for a long time. His fingers traced the air just above a map showing troop movements, as if he were following a route he'd once traveled himself. A few visitors passed by him, but he seemed oblivious to their presence, lost in memories that were clearly more vivid than anything the museum displays could capture. When he reached the Iwo Jima section, his pace slowed even further. This was where the museum's most powerful artifacts were housed. Original letters from soldiers to their families. Personal effects recovered from the battlefield. Photographs that had been classified for decades before being released to the public. The centerpiece of this section was the Medal of Honor exhibit. 23 individual displays, each one carefully crafted to honor a recipient's service and sacrifice. The lighting was subdued, reverent, designed to create a sense of sacred space within the larger museum. Sarah noticed the visitor had been standing in front of one particular display for an unusually long time. She glanced at her watch. 15 minutes. That was longer than most people spent in the entire Medal of Honor section. Curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to approach. As she walked closer, she could see which display had captured his attention. Technical Sergeant William Billy Chin, 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for actions during the rescue of the Lost Battalion in the Vosges Mountains of France, October 1944. The photograph showed a young Asian American man in uniform, probably no more than 22 or 23 years old. The official citation described how Technical Sergeant Chin had single-handedly assaulted 3 machine gun positions, allowing his trapped unit to escape encirclement. He'd been killed in the action, but his sacrifice had saved 37 American soldiers. Sarah knew this story by heart. She told it to hundreds of school children and museum visitors. What she didn't understand was why this elderly man was staring at the photograph with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Sir." Sarah approached carefully, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a deeply personal moment. "Are you all right?" The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph, and his lips were moving slightly, as if he were having a conversation with the image behind the glass. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize anyone was watching." "It's quite all right," Sarah replied gently. "This section affects a lot of people. Did you know someone who served with the 442nd? The man was quiet for a long moment. When he looked at Sarah, she was struck by the depth of pain in his eyes. It wasn't the distant sadness of historical tragedy. It was immediate, personal, raw. "In a manner of speaking," he said. "I knew Billy Chin very well." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Technical Sergeant Chin had died in 1944. This man appeared to be in his late 80s or early 90s, which would make him the right age to have served in World War II. But according to the records, Chin's entire unit had been wiped out in the action that earned him the Medal of Honor. "Were you in the 442nd as well?" she asked. "I was there," he said simply. "October 27, 1944. Vosges Mountains. I was part of the Lost Battalion." Sarah's professional skepticism warred with growing excitement. The museum occasionally received visits from World War II veterans, but they were becoming increasingly rare. Most of the men who'd fought in that war were well into their 90s now, and many were too frail to travel. But something about this man's demeanor convinced her he was telling the truth. The way he spoke about the date and location wasn't the careful recitation of someone who'd researched the facts. It was the automatic recall of someone who'd lived through the experience. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what's your name?" The man hesitated. "Robert Tanaka. Private First Class Robert Tanaka, 442nd Regimental Combat Team." Sarah's excitement grew. If this man was who he claimed to be, he was a living piece of history. The 442nd RCT was one of the most decorated units in American military history, composed primarily of Japanese-American soldiers who'd volunteered to fight for a country that had imprisoned their families in internment camps. "Mr. Tanaka, would you be willing to share your story? We have researchers who would love to interview veterans, especially from the 442nd. Robert shook his head slowly. "I've never talked about it. Not to researchers, not to historians, not even to my own family. Some stories are too heavy to share. But you're here now," Sarah pointed out. "You came to see Billy's exhibit. That must mean something." Robert turned back to the photograph. "Billy saved my life. All of our lives. We were trapped for days without food, water, or ammunition. The Germans had us surrounded, and it looked like we were all going to die in those mountains." His voice took on the cadence of someone recounting a story he'd replayed in his mind thousands of times. "Billy volunteered for the assault. We all knew it was a suicide mission. The machine gun positions were too well defended. The terrain was impossible. But someone had to try." Sarah listened in rapt attention as Robert continued. "I was supposed to go with him. We'd been buddies since basic training. But I'd taken shrapnel in my leg the day before, and I couldn't keep up. Billy went alone." The pain in Robert's voice was palpable. "I watched him go up that hill. Watched him take out the first position, then the second. By the time he reached the third, he was already wounded. But he kept going. He kept fighting until we could escape." "And you survived," Sarah said softly. "I survived," Robert confirmed, but there was no joy in his voice. "I made it home, got married, had children, lived a full life. All because Billy Chin gave up his." Sarah found herself struggling to maintain her professional composure. This wasn't just a historical account. This was a first-hand testimony from one of the last surviving members of one of America's most heroic military units. "Mr. Tanaka, the information we have suggests that all members of the Lost Battalion were accounted for in official records. How is it possible that you're here?" Robert's laugh was bitter. "Bureaucracy. Paperwork getting lost. Names getting confused. The army had bigger things to worry about than tracking every soldier who made it home. I was hospitalized for months after the rescue, transferred between different medical units. By the time I was discharged, the war was over and everyone just wanted to move on. He paused, studying the photograph again. I never corrected the record because I felt guilty for surviving when Billy didn't. I felt like I didn't deserve the recognition that came with being part of that unit. So I stayed quiet, lived my life, and tried to forget. But you couldn't forget, Sarah observed. No, Robert admitted. I never forgot. And when I heard this museum had an exhibit honoring Billy, I knew I had to come see it for myself. Sarah glanced around the museum. The afternoon was growing late, and there were only a few other visitors wandering through the galleries. Her mind was racing with the implications of Robert's presence. If his story was true, he represented a living connection to one of the most significant military actions of World War II. More than that, he was the key to understanding the human cost of heroism. The guilt carried by survivors, the weight of undeserved life, the burden of memory that couldn't be shared or forgotten. Mr. Tanaka, she said carefully, I think there are people here who need to meet you. Sarah excused herself and walked quickly to the museum's administrative offices. Her heart was pounding as she knocked on the door of Dr. James Morrison, the museum's chief historian and a retired Army colonel who dedicated his post-military career to preserving the stories of World War II veterans. Dr. Morrison, I need you to come to the Medal of Honor exhibit immediately. We have a situation. Dr. Morrison looked up from his computer, noting the urgency in Sarah's voice. What kind of situation? We have a visitor claiming to be a survivor of the Lost Battalion rescue in the Vosges Mountains. He says he knew Technical Sergeant Shin personally. Dr. Morrison's expression changed immediately. He'd spent years researching the 442nd RCT, and he knew the official records by heart. According to every document in the Army's archives, there had been no survivors of Chin's unit from that specific action. Are you certain he's not just someone who's researched the story? I'm certain, Sarah replied. The way he talks about it, the details he knows, the emotion in his voice. This isn't someone who read about it in books. This is someone who was there. Dr. Morrison grabbed his jacket and followed Sarah back to the Medal of Honor exhibit. As they approached, they could see Robert still standing in front of Chin's display, lost in conversation with the photograph. Mr. Tanaka? Dr. Morrison introduced himself. I'm Dr. Morrison, the chief historian here. Sarah tells me you served with Technical Sergeant Chin. Robert turned to face them, and Dr. Morrison immediately understood what Sarah meant about the man's bearing. Despite his age and apparent frailty, there was something unmistakably military about his posture and the way he made eye contact. I did, Robert confirmed. October 1944, Vosges Mountains. I was part of the unit that Billy died saving. Dr. Morrison studied Robert's face carefully. As a historian and former military officer, he developed a keen sense for distinguishing between genuine veterans and those who fabricated military service. Everything about Robert's demeanor suggested authenticity. Mr. Tanaka, I have to tell you that official Army records indicate all members of that rescue operation were killed in action. You're not listed among the survivors. I know, Robert replied simply. I've lived with that fact for nearly 80 years. Dr. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. If Robert was telling the truth, he represented a historical discovery of enormous significance. Not just as a survivor of a famous battle, but as a living witness to one of the most heroic actions in American military history. Would you be willing to verify your service record? We have resources here that could help confirm your identity and service history. Robert hesitated. I've spent my entire life avoiding that kind of attention. I never wanted to be part of the official story. Sir, Dr. Morrison said respectfully, with all due respect, you are part of the story whether you wanted to be or not. Your survival is part of Billy Chin's legacy. It's proof that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Sarah watched as Robert wrestled with the decision. She could see the decades of guilt and self-imposed isolation warring with something else. Maybe a desire to finally honor his fallen friend properly. Maybe simple exhaustion from carrying the burden alone for so long. What would you need from me? Robert asked finally. Dr. Morrison pulled out his phone. With your permission, I'd like to call some colleagues. Military historians, archivists, people who can help us piece together your story and correct the historical record. Robert looked back at the photograph of Billy Chin. For a moment, Sarah thought he might change his mind and walk away. But then he straightened his shoulders with a resolution that reminded her he'd once been a young soldier in the world's most dangerous conflict. Billy deserves to have the whole story told, Robert said. If sharing my part of it honors his memory, then I'm ready to talk. Dr. Morrison's phone call brought immediate results. Within an hour, the museum had contacted military historians from 3 universities, an archivist from the National Personnel Records Center, and a researcher who'd spent years documenting the service of Japanese-American soldiers in World War II. As word spread through the historical community, something extraordinary began to happen. What had started as a quiet afternoon at a small museum was becoming a major historical event. Robert Tanaka, a man who'd spent 8 decades in anonymity, was about to become the key to understanding one of America's most heroic military actions. But first, the museum staff wanted to do something more immediate and more personal. Dr. Morrison gathered the entire museum staff in the Medal of Honor exhibit. Docents, security guards, administrators, researchers, maintenance staff. Everyone who worked to preserve and share the stories of American heroes. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Morrison announced, I want you to meet someone special. This is Robert Tanaka, Private First Class Robert Tanaka of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Mr. Tanaka was saved by Technical Sergeant Billy Chin's heroic actions in the Vosges Mountains in October 1944. The effect was immediate. Every person in the room understood the significance of what they were hearing. They were in the presence of living history, a direct connection to one of the most celebrated acts of courage in American military history. Sarah was the first to stand at attention. Then Dr. Morrison. Then every veteran among the staff, followed by everyone else. Without anyone giving an order or making a suggestion, they were all saluting Robert Tanaka. Robert's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down his face as he looked around at the faces of people who understood the weight of what he'd carried for so many years. People who recognized that his survival wasn't something to feel guilty about, but something to celebrate as part of Billy Chin's lasting legacy. Slowly, carefully, Robert returned their salute. His hand came up with the precision of muscle memory that had never faded, despite 8 decades of civilian life. For a moment, he was no longer an elderly man in a worn jacket. He was Private First Class Robert Tanaka, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, honoring his fallen comrade and accepting the recognition he denied himself for a lifetime. The salutes held for nearly a full minute. No one wanted to be the first to break the moment. In that quiet museum gallery, surrounded by artifacts and photographs, something sacred was happening. History wasn't just being preserved, it was being completed. When they finally lowered their hands, Dr. Morrison stepped forward. Mr. Tanaka, with your permission, we'd like to add your story to Billy Chin's exhibit. Not to change anything about his heroism, but to show the full impact of his sacrifice. To show that his actions saved real people who went on to live full lives. Robert nodded slowly. I think Billy would like that. He always said the mission was about getting everyone home, even if he couldn't come home himself. Over the following weeks, Robert worked with historians to piece together the complete story of the Lost Battalion rescue. His testimony filled in gaps that had puzzled researchers for decades. His survival provided context for understanding the true scope of Billy Chin's heroism. The updated exhibit became one of the museum's most popular displays, not because the story had changed, but because it was now complete. Visitors could see not just the heroic action, but its lasting impact. They could understand that Billy Chin's sacrifice had real meaning, real consequences, real value that extended far beyond the moment of his death. Robert became a regular presence at the museum, not as an exhibit himself, but as a living bridge between past and present. School groups would listen in awe as he described what it was like to serve in the 442nd RCT. Veterans would seek him out for conversations about service and sacrifice. But most importantly, Robert found peace with his survival. After 8 decades of guilt, he finally understood that honoring Billy Chin's memory didn't require him to apologize for being alive. It required him to live a life worthy of the sacrifice that had saved him. The museum staff learned something important too. History isn't just about artifacts and documents. It's about people. Living people who carry stories too important to be lost, too powerful to remain hidden, too sacred to be forgotten. Sometimes those people walk through our doors every day, and we don't recognize them until they're standing in front of the story they helped create. Sometimes the most extraordinary visitors are the ones who look most ordinary. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who spend a lifetime trying to disappear. Robert Tanaka taught them that history isn't something that happened to other people in other times. It's something that walks among us every day, carried by people who've seen things we can barely imagine, done things we can hardly comprehend, and survived experiences that shape the world we live in today. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever met someone who carried a piece of history you didn't recognize until later? Someone whose quiet presence held stories that could change how you understood the past? Tell us in the comments about the unrecognized heroes in your own life. And if you believe these hidden stories deserve to be shared, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Every story we tell is a reminder that extraordinary people are everywhere, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be honored, waiting to be understood. We'll see you in the next one.